Chapter 10. The Caravan. "Do not harm him," said Kazarak. "He is my sword brother, Tarl of Bristol." Kazarak's remark was in accord with the strange warrior codes of Gar, codes which were as natural to him as the air he breathed, and codes which I, in the chamber of the Council Caravan, had sworn to uphold. One who has shed your blood, or whose blood you have shed, becomes your sword brother, unless you formally repudiate the blood upon your weapons. It is part of the kinship of Gorean warriors, regardless of what city it is, or to which they owe their allegiance. It is a matter of caste, an expression of respect for those who share their station and profession, having nothing to do with cities or homestones. As I stood tensely, ringed by the lances of the caravan guards, the wall of Thalians parted to allow the approach of Minar of the merchant caste. A bejeweled curtain platform slung between the slow swaying bodies of two of the broad Thalorians appeared. The beasts were halted by their strapped master, and after some seconds the curtains parted. Seated inside on several pillows of tasseled silk was a mammoth toad of a man, whose head was as round as a tarn's egg, the eyes nearly lost in the folds of fat, pocket skin. A slender, straggling wisp of hair dropped languidly from the fat chin. The little eyes of the merchant swept the scene quickly, like a bird's, startling in their contrast with the plethoric giganticism of his frame. "So," said the merchant, "Kazarak of Port Gar has met his match." "It is the first challenge I have ever lost," replied Kozak proudly. "Who are you?" asked Minar, leaning forward a bit, inspecting first me and then Telina, whom he regarded with small interest. "Tarl of Bristol," I said, "and this is my woman, whom I claim by sword right." Minar closed his eyes, and opened them, and then pulled upon his wispy beard. He had, of course, never heard of Bristol, but did not wish to admit it, at least before his men. Moreover, he was far too shrewd to pretend that he had heard of the city. After all, what if there was no such city? Minar looked at the ring of mounted spearmen encircling him. "Does any man in my service challenge for the woman of Tarl of Bristol?" he asked. The warriors shifted nervously. Kazarak laughed, a derisive snort. One of the mounted warriors said, "Kazarak of Port Gar is the best sword in the caravan." Mintar's face clouded. "Tarl of Bristol," he said, "you have disabled my finest sword." One or two of the mounted warriors readjusted their grip upon their lances. I became accurately conscious of the proximity of the several points. "You owe me a debt," said Minar. "Can you pay the hiring price of such a sword?" "I have no goods other than this girl," I said, "and I will not give her up." Minar sniffed. "In the wagons I have 400 fully as beautiful, destined for the city of tents." He looked at Telina carefully, but his appraisal was remote, detached. Her sale price would not bring half the hiring price of a sword such as that of Kazarak of Port Gar. Telina reacted as if slapped. "Then I cannot pay the debt I owe you." "I am a merchant," said Minar. "It is my code to see that I am paid." I set myself ready to sell my life dearly. Oddly enough, my only fear was what would happen to the girl. "Kazarak of Port Gar," said Minar, "do you agree to surrender the balance of your hiring price to Tarl of Bristol if he takes your place in my service?" Yes, responded Kazarak. He has done me honor, and he's my sword brother. Mintar seemed satisfied. He looked upon me. Tal of Bristol, he said, do you take service with Mintar of the merchant caste? If I do not, I asked, then I shall order my men to kill you, and we both shall suffer a loss. Oh, Ubar of merchants, I said, I would not willingly see your profits jeopardized. Mintar relaxed upon the cushions and seemed pleased. I realized to my amazement that he had been afraid that some particle of his investment might have been sacrificed. He would have had a man killed rather than risk the loss of a tenth of a Tarn disc. So well he knew the codes of his caste. What about the girl? Asked Mintar. She must accompany me, I said. If you wish, he said, I will buy her. She is not for sale. 20 Tarn discs, Mintar proposed. I laughed. Mintar smiled too. 40, he said. No, I said. He seemed at this less pleased. 45, he said, his voice most flat. No, I said. Is she of high caste? Asked Mintar, apparently puzzled at my lack of interest in his bargaining. Perhaps his price was too low for a girl of high caste. I am, announced Telina proudly, the daughter of a rich merchant, richest on all Gor, stolen from her father by a Tarnsman. His Tarn was killed, and he's taking me to Bristol to be his slave. I am the richest merchant upon Gor, said Mintar calmly. Telina gulped. If your father is a merchant, tell me his name. I will know of him. Great Mintar, I spoke up. Forgive this she-Thalin. Her father was a goat-keeper by the swamp forests of Ar, and I did steal her. But she begged me to take her from the village. She foolishly ran away with me, thinking I would take her to Ar, to dress her in jewels and silks, and give her quarters in the high cylinder. As soon as we left her village, I put the bracelets upon her, and am taking her to Bristol, where she will tend my goats. The soldiers all laughed uproariously, Kazrak loudest of all, and for a moment I was afraid Telina was going to announce that she was the daughter of the Ubar Merlinius, preferring possible impalement to the insult of being considered the offspring of a goat-keeper. Mintar seemed amused. While in my service, you may keep her on my chain if you wish, he said. Mintar is generous, I granted. No, said Telina, I will share the tent of my warrior. If you like. Mintar, paying no more attention to Telina, I will arrange her sale in the city of tents, and add her price to your wages. If I sell her, I will sell her myself, I said. I am an honest merchant, said Mintar. I would not cheat you, but you do well to handle your own affairs. Mintar then eased his great frame deeper into those silken pillows, and motioned the strap-master of his Thalion to close the curtains. Before they swept shut, he said, You will never get 45 Tarn discs. I suspected he was right. He undoubtedly had better merchandise, more reasonably priced. Led by Kazrak, I went with Telina, walking back along the line of wagons to see where she would be placed. Besides one of the several long wagons of the short, covered with yellow and blue silk. I removed the bracelets from her wrists and turned her over to an attendant. I have a spare ankle ring, he said, and took Telina by the arm, thrusting her inside the wagon. In the wagon there were some 20 girls, all dressed in the slave livery of Gor, perhaps 10 on a side, chained to a metal bar which ran the length of the wagon. Telina would not like that. Before she disappeared, she called over her shoulder most saucily, "You're not rid of me as easily as this, Tarl of Bristol." "See if you can slip the ankle ring," laughed Kazarak, and led me back among the supply wagons. We had gone scarcely 10 paces, and Telina could hardly have been fastened in the wagon before we heard a female scream of pain and a bevy of howls and shrieks. From the wagon came the sound of the rolling bodies, slamming and cracking against the sides, and the rattling of chains on wood, pierced by squeals of pain and anger. The attendant lapped into the back of the wagon with a strap, and there was added to the din the sound of his curses, and the crack of the strap as he smartly laid about him. As Kazarak and I watched, the attendant, both puffing and furious, emerged from the wagon, dragging Telina by the hair. As Telina struggled and kicked, and the girls in the wagon shouted their approval and encouragement to the attendant, he angrily hurled Telina into my arms. Her hair was in wild disarray. There was nail marks on her shoulder, and 4 strap welts upon her back. Her arm was bruised, and her dress had been half torn from her. "Keep her in your tent," snarled the attendant. "Let the priest kings blast me if she didn't do it," said Kazarak with admiration. "A true she-Thalian." Telina lifted a bloody nose to me and smiled brightly. The next 2 days were among the happiest of my life, as Telina and I became a part of Mintar's slow, ample caravan, members of its graceful, interminable, colorful procession. It seemed the routine of the journey would never end, and I drew enarmored in the long line of wagons, each filled with its various goods, those mysterious metals and gems, rolls of cloth, foodstuffs, wines and paga, weapons and harness, cosmetics and perfume, medicines and slaves. Mintar's caravan, like most, was harnessed long before dawn, and traveled until the heat of the day. Camp would be made early in the afternoon. The beasts would be watered and fed, guards set, wagons secured, and the members of the caravan would turn to their cooking fires. In the evening, the strapped masters and warriors would amuse themselves with stories and songs, recounting their exploits, fictitious and otherwise, and bawling out their raucous harmonies under the influence of paga. In those days I learned to master the High Thalian, one of which had been assigned to me by the caravan's Thalarian master. These gigantic lizards had been bred upon Gor for 1,000 generations before the first Tarn was ever tamed. They were raised from the leathery shell to carry warriors. They responded to voice signals, conditioned into their tiny brains in their training years. Nonetheless, the butt of one's lance, striking about the ear or eye openings, for there are few other sensitive areas on their scaled hides, is occasionally necessary to impress your will upon the monster. The High Thalarian, unlike their drafted brethren, the slow-moving, 4-footed broad Thalarian, were carnivorous. However, their metabolism was slower than that of a Tarn, whose mind never seemed far from food, and if it is available, could consume half its weight in a single day. Moreover, they needed far less water than Tarns. To me, the most puzzling thing about the domesticated Thalian, and the way in which they differed most obviously from wild Thalarians and the lizards of my native planet, was their stamina, their capacity for sustained movement. When the High Thalian moves slowly, its stride is best described as a proud, stalking movement, each great clawed foot striking the earth with a measured rhythm. When urged to speed, however, the High Thalian bounds in great leaping movements that carry it 20 paces at a time. The Thalarian saddle, unlike the Tarn saddle, is constructed to absorb shock, Primarily, this is done by constructing the tree of the saddle in such a way that the leather seat is mounted on a sort of hydraulic fitting, which actually floats in a thick lubricant. Not only does this lubricant absorb much of the shock involved, but it tends, except under abnormal stress, to keep the seat of the saddle parallel to the ground. In spite of this invention, the mounted warriors always wear, as an essential portion of their equipment, a thick leather belt tightly buckled about their abdomen. In addition, the mounted warriors inevitably wear a high, soft pair of boots called Thalarian boots. These protect their legs from those abrasive hides of their mounts. When a Thalarian runs, its hide could tear the protected flesh from a man's bones. Kazrak, as he had promised, turned over the balance of his hiring price to me, a very respectable 80 Tarn discs. I argued with him to accept 40, on the ground that he was a sword brother, and at last convinced him to accept half of his own wages back. I felt better about this arrangement. Also, I didn't want Kazrak, when his wound was healed, to be reduced to challenging some luckless warrior for a bottle of Kalna wine. We, with Telina, shared a tent, and at Kazrak's amusement, I set aside a portion of the tent for the girl's own private use, protecting it with a silk hanging. Because of the miserable condition of Telina's single garment, Kazrak and I proceeded from the supply master some changes of slave livery for the girl. This seemed to me the most appropriate way to diminish any possible suspicion as to her true identity. From his own Tarn discs, Kazrak purchased 2 additional articles which he regarded as essential: a collar, which he had properly engraved, and a slave whip. We returned to the tent, handing the new livery to Telina, who in a fury regarded the brief, diagonally stripped garments. She bit her lower lip, and if Kazrak had not been there, would undoubtedly have roundly informed me of her displeasure. Did you expect to be dressed as a free woman?" I snapped. She glared upon me, knowing that she must play her role, at least in the presence of Kazrak. She tossed her head haughtily. "Of course not," she said, adding ironically, "Master." Her back straight as a Tarn goad, she disappeared behind the silk hanging. A moment later, the torn rag of blue silk flew out from behind the hanging. A moment or two after, Telina stepped forth for our inspection, brazen and insolent. She wore the diagonally striped slave livery of Gor, as had Sana, that briefly skirted, simple sleeveless garment. She turned before us. "Do I please you?" she asked. It was most obvious that she did. Telina was a beautiful girl. "Kneel," I said, drawing out the collar. Telina blanched, but as Kazrak chuckled, she knelt before me, her fists clenched. "Read it," I ordered. Telina looked at the engraved collar and shook with rage. "Read it," I said, aloud. She read the simple legend aloud. "I am the property of Tarl of Bristol." I snapped the slender steel collar upon her throat, placing the key within my pouch. "Shall I call for the iron?" asked Kazrak. "No," begged Telina now, for the first time frightened. "I shall not brand her today," I said, keeping a straight face. "By the priest kings," laughed Kazrak, "I believe you care for the she-Thorlian." "Leave us, warrior," I said. Kazrak then laughed again, winking at me, and backed with mock ceremony from the tent. Telina sprang to her feet, her 2 fists flying for my face, but I caught her wrists. "How dare you?" she raged. "Take this thing off," she commanded. She struggled, fiercely, futilely, when in sheer frustration she stopped squirming I then released her. She pulled at the circle of steel upon her throat. "Remove this degrading object," she commanded. "Now!" She faced me, her mouth trembling with rage. "The daughter of the Ubar of Ar wears no man's collar." "The daughter of the Ubar of Ar," I said, "wears the collar of Tarl of Bristol." There was a long pause. "I suppose," she said, attempting to save face, "it would perhaps be appropriate for a Tarnsman to place his collar on the captive daughter of a rich merchant." "Or the daughter of a goat-keeper," I added. Her eyes snapped at me. "Yes, perhaps." "Very well, I concede the reasonableness of your plan." Then she held out her small hand imperiously. "Give me the key," she said, "so that I may remove this when I please." "I will keep the key," I spoke, "and it will be removed, if at all, when I please." She straightened and turned away, enraged but most helpless. "Very well," she said. Then her eyes lit upon the sentient object Kazarak had donated to the project of taming what he called the She-Thalian, the slave whip. "What is the meaning of that?" "Surely you are familiar with a slave whip?" I asked, picking it up and, with amusement, slapping it once or twice within my palm. "Yes," she said, regarding me evenly. "I have often used it on my own slaves. Is it now to be used on me?" "If necessary," I said. "You wouldn't have the nerve." "More likely the inclination." She smiled. Her next remark astonished me. "Use it on me if I do not please you, Tarl of Bristol." I pondered at this, but she had turned away. In the next few days, to my surprise, Telina was buoyant, cheerful, excited. She became interested in the caravan, and would spend hours walking alongside the colored wagons, sometimes hitching rides with the strap-masters, wheedling from them a piece of fruit or sweetmeat. She even conversed delightedly with the inmates of the blue and yellow wagons, bringing them precious tidbits of camp news, teasing them as to how handsome their new masters might be. She soon became a favorite of the caravan. Once or twice mounted warriors of the caravan had accosted her, but on reading her collar had backed away, grumbling, enduring with good humor her jibes and taunts. In the early afternoon, when the caravan halted, she would help Kazarak and me set up our tent, and would then gather wood for a fire. She would cook for us, kneeling by the fire, her hair bound back so as not to catch the sparks, her face sweaty, and intent upon the piece of meat she was most likely burning. After the meal she would clean and then polish our gear, sitting upon the tent carpet between us, chatting about small, pleasant inconsequentialities of the day. "Slavery apparently agrees with her," I remarked to Kazarak. "Not slavery," he smiled, and I puzzled as to the meaning of his remark. Telina then blushed and lowered her face, rubbing vigorously on the leather of my Thalarian boots.